Well, as I mentioned, the markets do have a great deal to digest this week. Aside from a possible rate drop here, there's the US election with the fiscal cliff looming and the transition of leadership in China, a 1-in-10-year event as conservatives and reformists battle for influence. Professor Geoffrey Garrett is now the Dean of the University of Sydney Business School and Professor of Politics at the United States Studies Centre, a long-time watcher of both US and Chinese affairs. Professor Geoffrey Garrett, welcome to the programme.
My pleasure, Tiki.
Well, this must be one of the tightest races that you've seen in your time. I know there were some quite good job creation figures, but do you see Obama coming through now in the swing states?
Well, I think on the one hand, Tiki, the election has really come down to being a referendum on the state of the health of the US economy, and that's not good news for Barack Obama, even with the healthy jobs figures last week. But I still think Barack Obama is going to win the election in a squeaker, and the reason is that, as you know, US elections are state-by-state, winner-take-all when it comes to the presidency, and I think the states just stack up a little bit better for Barack Obama than they do for Mitt Romney.
Yeah, I noticed one commentator saying that the economies probably won't go over a fiscal cliff immediately anyway. It will start slipping down a slope.
Well, I think that's the conventional view of the US that says its fiscal problems are so bad that it's going to drag the US economy down. But I actually think the strategy in the US, the implicit strategy in the US, is the same today as it was in the 1990s, which is that the US should grow its way out of debt and deficit, not cut its way out. That's what Clinton did, Bill Clinton did spectacularly successfully in the 1990s. I don't think it'll be as successful this decade, but I think the US's fundamentals are still just a lot better than many of us give the US credit for. The US is not a basket case European economy. Yes, it has fiscal problems, but its demography looks really good. Its welfare state isn't nearly as expensive, and the US is still the most innovative major economy. So maybe it's true that the US really has no choice but to kick the can down the road because its politics is so gridlocked. But I don't think at the end of the day that's really going to be a disaster, because I think the fundamentals of the US economy are still much stronger than we often hear about or think about in these moments of extreme crisis and panic.
Very difficult, of course, in this sort of scenario for business to plan much, particularly in terms of what they do with the number of employees they have. But if looking at Mitt Romney and what he wants to promote business confidence, he's got that on the one hand, but then someone like Robert Shiller points out he also wants to drastically cut government spending, and that goes back to your issue about growth.
Yeah, I think if we look at the US situation at the moment, I mean, let's take somebody like Ben Bernanke, who was the chairman of the Fed, who was appointed by George W. Bush. Bernanke essentially has said and acted upon his view that he supports the kind of fiscal stimulus that's in the US economy that Obama has presided over. So if we can assume that the chairman of the Fed is independent and the chairman of the Fed has to worry both about growth and about employment and then also about inflation, I think the Fed is telling us that US policy probably is on a reasonable trajectory. And of course, I think global markets are telling us the same thing. After all, the US can still borrow money at about 1.7%, unlimited money at 1.7%. And why wouldn't you borrow in that environment?
Is it fair to say that securities holders and shareholders should be much more focused on what the Fed does than which guy gets a shoe into the White House?
Well, of course, there's a lot going on there. What I would say about 2013 is that if Barack Obama's president, it's really unlikely that much will change in terms of domestic policy. I don't think he's got a big domestic agenda, and I don't think he has the political capital to get much through. If Romney was president and Republicans do well in congressional elections, there'd obviously be sort of much more appetite for some real red meat, the kind of cutting that you talked about. But at the end of the day, what we've seen from Romney is that he's an absolute centrist and an absolute pragmatist. And I think a Romney presidency would look, on all dimensions, a lot more like an Obama presidency than many people might think.
Now, Geoff, there's been very little discussion in the presidential debates, and in fact, indeed in the election, about the transition in China, even though that arguably is likely to have more impact on global markets.
Yeah, and I really think the big issue there is how much power does Xi Jinping have behind him as the president? The people who know China tell me that there's actually quite a bit of reformist zeal and reformist steel in Xi Jinping, the presumptive next president. The question is whether he has the support of the Standing Committee of the Politburo behind him. We don't know that, and of course it's happening in an environment in China which is extraordinarily difficult because growth has slowed considerably, certainly by Chinese standards, and lots of people are worried about the kind of social unrest that's in the country, partially because the economy is slowing down, but partially from a frustration that the pace of reform under the current Hu Jintao regime hasn't been nearly as fast as many people hoped for.
And again, I think that this transition is all the more significant because the Chinese government has so much more direct control over what happens with the economy.
Yeah, absolutely, and we see that every day. The Chinese government can increase or decrease reserve requirements on banks. They can obviously go on massive infrastructure spends when they need to. They've still got the weapons they had in 2009, and you'll remember then that they went on a massive credit expansion and fiscal expansion because they knew that their export markets were just going to dry up around the world, a decline in world trade of 30% in 1 year. What seems to be happening at the moment is that the Chinese aren't quite as worried about the health of the global economy, so they haven't acted as decisively. They still have all of the weapons in their arsenal. I guess the thing that we should be worried about, or we should hope for, is that the leadership in transition in China is sufficiently smooth that the new president has the power to use those weapons if and when he thinks they need to be used.
We've had, of course, the scandal of Bo Xilai, the fortunes of Wen Jiabao, and then Xi Jinping going missing. And we've also got this massive change at the Politburo's Standing Committee. Has there ever been a transition where the onlookers were sort of more in the dark about what might eventuate?
Well, obviously, opacity has been a feature of transitions in communist parties, not only in China but in the old Soviet Union for a very long time. People are typically trying to read tea leaves and things like that. On Xi Jinping's going missing, did he have some physical ailment or was something more nefarious going on? We don't know. New York Times put out this very big story that Wen Jiabao, his family and his associates, the current Chinese premier, is worth $2.7 billion. We have the Bo Xilai corruption case and murder case against his wife. What's probably going on is that we actually have much more inside access and actually visibility into politics in China than we've ever had before. So I don't know if this is worse, but certainly we're seeing more of it.
Professor Geoffrey Garrett, it's going to be quite a week. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Tiki.